My family wanted me to fund their lavish lifestyle. I uncovered their fake marriage. I never imagined that my own family would turn on me like this. It started innocently enough, just a casual request from my brother and his wife. They were struggling financially, and after all the times I'd supported them in the past, I didn't hesitate to offer a loan. But what I didn't know was that their struggle wasn't as real as they made it seem. I was blindsided when my brother, Ethan, started asking for more money. At first, it was for emergencies, but then it escalated: vacations, fancy dinners, and extravagant gifts for his wife, Claire. Something didn't feel right. The guilt trip started, too. "We've done so much for you," they'd say. "Can't you just help us out this one last time?" But the tipping point came when I found an envelope stuffed with receipts for purchases I had no idea about. And then, the real shocker, a mysterious email buried deep in Ethan's inbox, revealing a truth that no one in the family knew. The marriage that everyone thought was perfect, the one where they portrayed themselves as this inseparable, loving couple, was nothing but a facade. They weren't struggling, they were playing me, using me to fund their fake life. But what I didn't expect was how far they would go to protect their lies, even if it meant destroying me in the process. The moment I uncovered their deception, everything changed. The truth was far darker than I could have imagined, and I wasn't about to let them get away with it. My name is Amara, and I used to think my family was close-knit, like the kind of family you see in movies, where everyone has each other's backs no matter what. We'd gather for birthdays, Christmas, and every little milestone in between. My parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins filled our house with love and laughter. And I, the youngest of 3 siblings, always believed I was a cherished part of that circle. Growing up, my brother Ethan and I were close. Sure, we had our sibling fights, who didn't, but there was a sense of unspoken loyalty between us. He was the older brother who always looked out for me, and I was the younger sister who could count on him for advice, even if I didn't always listen. But, as we grew older, I began to notice subtle shifts in his behavior. Small things at first, like his frequent requests for financial help. They didn't seem too out of the ordinary at the time. After all, life had a way of throwing curveballs, and Ethan had just gotten married to Claire, a woman who seemed sweet enough but was always a little too polished in the way she presented herself. They'd only been married for 2 years, but already, their life together seemed like one big highlight reel. Expensive vacations to places like Paris, dinners at top-tier restaurants, and designer clothes that Claire would flaunt at every family gathering. Ethan, who used to live on a modest budget, seemed to have suddenly come into money. But that didn't add up with the small business he'd started a year ago, which, despite his hard work, was barely breaking even. As I watched Ethan and Claire live this seemingly perfect life, I started to feel something I couldn't quite place. A nagging feeling that maybe things weren't as perfect as they appeared. And I wasn't the only one to notice. My parents began to question where Ethan's money was coming from. "Amara, have you noticed anything strange about their spending lately?" my mom would ask, her voice filled with concern. "I mean, he's always been careful with his finances. Now, it's like they're living in another world." I didn't want to believe it. Ethan was my brother, and I had always trusted him. But that feeling deep in my gut kept growing, gnawing at me, until one day, I finally decided to ask him directly. It was at a family gathering. The house was filled with chatter, the smell of roast chicken and fresh bread wafting through the air, but I couldn't shake the thought. "Ethan," I said, pulling him aside in the kitchen. "Can we talk?" His face lit up with that familiar grin, but I could see the tension in his eyes. I had no idea at that moment that I was about to uncover something that would completely shatter my perception of him, and change everything. He brushed me off at first, giving some vague excuse about business setbacks, but I pressed on, and the truth began to slip out. A truth I didn't want to hear, but couldn't ignore. The more I dug, the more I realized just how deep the deception went. What I found wasn't just a couple of bad financial decisions, it was a web of lies that my brother had spun around me and the entire family. The house I grew up in, the place where I felt safe and loved, suddenly felt like it was filled with secrets. Secrets that weren't just mine to uncover, but secrets that would change my life forever. I had no idea then that the cost of my discovery would be far higher than I ever imagined. Ethan was always the golden child in our family. As the eldest, he carried a certain gravitas that came with being the firstborn. From an early age, he was the one who had to set the example for my younger sister, Lily, and me. He had a natural charm, a way with people that made him seem untouchable, like someone who could talk his way out of anything. He excelled in school, made friends effortlessly, and had big dreams from the moment he could talk about his future. We all admired him for it. I had always looked up to him, not just as a brother, but as a role model. But as we grew older, I started noticing a shift in him. It wasn't a dramatic change, it was subtle, like a crack in a beautiful vase that you don't see until the pieces start to fall apart. Ethan started to grow more distant and secretive, and I couldn't quite place why. He wasn't the same person I had shared so many memories with. And then, he married Claire. At first, I thought she was the one who had changed him. She was everything Ethan wasn't: polished, calculated, and always in control. It was as if she had this air of perfection that couldn't be touched, and for the first time in my life, I saw my brother, the golden child, not as someone who had it all together but as someone who was trying desperately to keep up with her. Claire was beautiful, there was no denying that. She was a former model, always dressed in the latest fashion, her long blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple. But I saw something beneath the surface. There was an edge to her, something cold and manipulative that no one else seemed to notice. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I didn't trust her. I think my gut knew something was wrong long before I ever had the evidence to prove it. Mom and Dad were always supportive of Ethan, as they should be. They had invested so much in his success, always offering him advice and helping him out when he needed it. My mom, in particular, was close to him, almost too close. She was proud of him, always talking about what a great job he was doing and how successful he was becoming. I never questioned it, after all, Ethan had always been the star of the family. But my dad, a man who usually stayed calm and collected, had begun to act differently around him. I'd overheard Dad on the phone a few times, talking in hushed tones, mentioning something about money. It was out of character for him to be so anxious, and it made me wonder what Ethan was up to. Lily, my younger sister, didn't seem to notice any of this. To her, Ethan was still the big brother who would do anything for her. He would always buy her gifts, take her on fun trips, and pay for things she needed. She adored him, and it made me wonder if she was blind to the subtle shifts in his behavior. Or perhaps, like me, she was hesitant to confront the changes in our family dynamic. But it was more than just Ethan and Claire's relationship that worried me, it was how everything was so intertwined with money. Ethan had started asking for more and more help. At first, it was for small things, like paying off his business loans or helping with a sudden tax issue. But then, it became bigger requests. Amara, can you lend us some money for this vacation? We've had a tough year, or the business is slow right now, but I swear it's just a phase. We'll pay you back. And, of course, I did it. I didn't question it. After all, family is family, right? But with every loan I gave and every expense I helped cover, I began to feel the weight of my financial insecurity. Why was I footing the bill for their lifestyle when I could barely keep my head above water? And that's when I started to question things. Was this just a phase, or was there something darker going on? Was I being taken advantage of by the people I loved most? The pieces started falling into place when I found that envelope, receipts from things that didn't add up, and that email. Suddenly, the comfortable, loving family I thought I knew didn't seem so solid anymore. I was no longer just Amara, the little sister, I was the one about to uncover something that would tear us all apart. It all began when I found the first receipt. I had no intention of snooping, but one evening, while visiting Ethan and Claire's house, I noticed something strange. I was helping Claire organize her kitchen, stacking dishes after dinner, when I noticed a small envelope tucked under a pile of magazines on the counter. It wasn't the envelope that caught my attention, but the name written across it in neat handwriting, Ethan's. At first, I thought nothing of it. But as I reached for it, a piece of paper slipped out from the corner, catching my eye. It was a receipt for a 5-star resort in the Maldives. I froze. Ethan had been telling everyone, including our parents, that they couldn't afford a vacation. He claimed that the business had been struggling, and that's why they weren't going anywhere this year. But here was a receipt for a vacation in one of the most luxurious places on the planet. And it wasn't a cheap stay, either, at least $5,000 for 1 week. My mind raced. Why had he lied? Why hadn't he just told the truth? And if he was hiding this from the family, what else was he hiding? I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a gift, something Claire had bought for herself. But when I glanced at the other receipts, my heart sank. There were purchases from high-end clothing stores, extravagant dinners at top-tier restaurants, and even a few items from a luxury car dealership. I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just an accidental mix-up. Ethan and Claire had been living in a different world, one they didn't want the family to see. The next day, I called Ethan under the pretense of catching up. We met at a coffee shop near his house. The conversation started casually. He asked about work, I told him about some minor updates in my life, but I was itching to ask him about the receipts. I decided to ease into it, figuring I'd get more information if I wasn't too direct. So, I began, taking a sip of my coffee. How's business going these days? Still keeping you busy? Ethan grinned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I could tell he was already nervous, sensing that I wasn't just making small talk. It's going great. Better than expected, he replied, leaning forward with his usual confidence. But there was a hesitation in his voice, like he wasn't sure how much to say. It wasn't like him to be so guarded. I pushed a little further. I saw you and Claire went on a trip recently. How was it? The Maldives, right? Looks amazing. His eyes widened for a moment, then quickly shifted. Oh, that, he said, a forced laugh escaping his lips. Yeah, Claire wanted to do something special for our anniversary. It was a last-minute thing, but you know how she is, she loves the finer things. I studied his face, searching for any hint of the truth, but his expression was carefully controlled. I wasn't buying it. I thought you guys were having some financial difficulties. I mean, that trip, it must have been really expensive. How are you affording all this? My tone wasn't confrontational, but there was an edge to it. I wasn't letting him off the hook. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing around the coffee shop as if looking for an escape. Look, Liv, I didn't want to worry you. Things are tight, yeah, but Claire and I have some investments coming through. We're going to be fine. It's just, we're still sorting things out. You know how it is. I could hear the desperation in his voice, and I felt a pit in my stomach. This didn't add up. I wanted to push him further, but something told me that doing so right then would only make him calm up more. So, I let it go for the time being, but I knew I couldn't let this go unanswered. A few days later, I was at a family dinner, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. My parents were there, chatting away as they always did, and Ethan and Claire were the picture of a happy couple, laughing and sharing stories. But I couldn't ignore the unease growing inside me. My mom had asked about Ethan's business again, and he gave the same excuses, how he was working on a big project that would turn things around. But there was something in his eyes that told me it was all a lie. I decided to confront him again, this time in front of everyone. I didn't want to be dramatic, but I needed answers, and I needed them now. As we all sat around the dinner table, I casually mentioned the vacation. So, Ethan, I began, keeping my voice casual, I heard the Maldives trip was incredible. You must be doing well to afford that kind of getaway. There was a brief silence, and I could feel all eyes turning to him. Ethan's face stiffened, and I could see the tension building in the room. Claire shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her smile faltering. It was a great trip, Ethan replied quickly, his voice tight. Like I said, we've had some opportunities. Nothing to worry about. But the way he said it felt forced, and I could see the cracks starting to show. Really? Because I found some receipts, I said, my voice rising slightly. Expensive meals, a car dealership, and a luxury hotel, that doesn't seem like nothing to worry about. The room fell silent. My parents exchanged confused glances, and Claire's face turned pale. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The truth was slowly unraveling, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on us all. Ethan's perfect facade was starting to crumble, and I was ready to find out exactly what he'd been hiding. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could tell that the more I pressed, the more his facade would crack. I wasn't backing down. Something was about to break, and I was finally ready to expose the lies. The silence at the dinner table hung thick and uncomfortably, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and for a split second, I almost regretted saying anything. But the regret quickly faded, replaced by a cold resolve. I wasn't going to let Ethan get away with this. Not this time. Ethan's face was flushed, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding mine. Claire sat perfectly still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I could see the tension in her jaw, she knew the game was up. Amara, you're overreacting, Ethan finally said, his voice strained but still laced with arrogance. He leaned forward, trying to regain control of the conversation. You know things aren't always as they seem. We've had some setbacks, but we're managing. Claire and I didn't want to worry anyone, especially you. This is a family dinner, Liv, not a time to start interrogating me. I'm not interrogating you, Ethan, I replied, my voice surprisingly steady. I'm asking questions that you should have answered a long time ago. Why haven't you been honest with us? Why have you been lying about your finances, your business, and this whole struggling act? Do you think we're blind? My words hung in the air, and I saw a flicker of guilt cross Ethan's face before he quickly masked it with a forced smile. Liv, you're being dramatic. I don't know what you're talking about. We're fine. I do not have it anymore. No, you're not fine, I snapped, my patience evaporating. I've seen the receipts. I've seen how much you've been spending, how you've been living this extravagant lifestyle when you've been claiming to be struggling. And now I'm starting to wonder, were you ever really struggling at all? Ethan's face went pale, the confident facade slipping further away. Claire's hands gripped the edge of her chair, her eyes wide but defensive. Liv, stop, she said in a low, controlled voice. You don't know what you're talking about. Ethan is working hard, and we're doing the best we can. You have no right to. I cut her off, my voice sharp. No, right? I have every right to know the truth. We're family, Claire. I've helped you both time and time again, and you've let me believe that you were in need, that you were struggling. But this is a lie. You and Ethan are playing everyone. Claire's eyes narrowed, her calm demeanor cracking. You think this is a game? Do you think we're playing you? You have no idea what we've been through, Amara. You're just jealous, because we've managed to make things work. Maybe if you worked harder, you wouldn't have to worry about us so much. The words hit me like a slap. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I was too stunned to speak. How could she say that to me? How could she turn this around and make it about me? Jealous? I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. You think I'm jealous of this lie? Of the way you've manipulated me into funding your so-called hardships? I've been giving you money because I thought you needed it. After all, I thought you were my family. But now I see the truth. You don't need me. You just wanted me to keep your fake life going. Ethan shifted in his seat, his mouth opening as though he were about to speak, but then he froze. I could see his thoughts racing behind his eyes, he knew the jig was up. The web of lies was falling apart, and he was about to be exposed. Enough, Liv, Ethan finally muttered, his voice low and defeated. You don't understand. It's not like that. Then tell me the truth, Ethan, I said, leaning forward, my eyes locked on his. Tell me why you lied to me. Tell me why you've been using me to fund a life that isn't even real. There was a long pause. The tension in the room was suffocating. My parents sat back in their chairs, too stunned to speak. My mother looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with confusion and hurt. My father's expression was grim, his hands clenched on the table. Ethan finally looked me in the eye, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his lies had finally caught up with him. Okay, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You want to know the truth? We weren't struggling. We just didn't want you to know that we weren't happy. Claire and we've been pretending. I've been pretending. The words hit me harder than I expected. My heart dropped into my stomach as the gravity of his confession sank in. Pretending? I repeated, unable to wrap my head around it. All of this was an act? Ethan nodded, his voice barely a whisper. Our marriage wasn't working. It never really was. But Claire and I were in too deep. We were living this perfect life on the outside while everything fell apart behind closed doors. And when we needed money to cover our problems, both financial and personal, I didn't know who else to turn to. So I started asking you for help. I didn't want to ruin everything, Liv. I didn't want you to see the truth. I didn't want anyone to know that we were falling apart. The room went silent again, and I could hear my breath, shallow and shaky. I had always trusted Ethan and always believed in the bond we shared as siblings. But now, everything I thought I knew about him was a lie. And the hardest part? I had unknowingly been complicit in his deception, feeding into his fake life and helping to prop up a marriage that was built on falsehoods. Claire, who had been silent through most of this exchange, finally spoke, her voice tight with bitterness. It wasn't just Ethan's fault. I was trapped, too. I didn't know how to get out of this. We were living in a world we had created, and the only way to survive was to keep up the facade. I thought if I kept pretending, it would all eventually work out. But it didn't. And now we're both paying the price. The confession hit me like a freight train. Ethan, my brother, the one I had always looked up to, was a stranger now. The person sitting in front of me was someone I didn't recognize, someone who had been living a double life. And Claire, the woman I'd welcomed into our family, wasn't the person I thought she was either. I sat there, my mind spinning, trying to process everything. The betrayal was so deep, so complete, that I didn't know where to start. My family, my brother, my sister-in-law, all of them had been hiding the truth from me, using me as a pawn in their twisted game. But as the silence stretched on, something inside me hardened. This wasn't over. The truth was out, but the consequences were just beginning. The days following that explosive confrontation felt like a blur. My world had shifted beneath my feet, and I wasn't sure where to stand anymore. Ethan's confession, though gut-wrenching, had been just the beginning of a long, painful unraveling. I didn't have the clarity I had hoped for at that moment, only a sense of coldness, like a wound that had been exposed but not yet healed. After the dinner, Ethan and Claire avoided me, as if they couldn't bear to face the consequences of their actions. My parents, still in shock from the truth, tried to process it in their way. My mother had been quiet, her eyes filled with sadness as she tried to understand how her eldest son had become a stranger. My father, ever the pragmatist, was furious, though he kept his anger contained, only speaking in short, sharp sentences when he did say anything. The family dynamic that had once been so warm and full of laughter now felt fragile, like something that could shatter with a single wrong word. It was clear that things couldn't go back to the way they were. There was no undoing the betrayal, no fixing the trust that had been broken. The money wasn't the issue anymore. The real problem was that everything, every relationship, every interaction, had been built on a lie. And I was left holding the pieces of that lie, trying to figure out how to pick them up. I didn't know how to feel about Ethan anymore. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to let him explain himself further, to believe that he was still my brother, the one I'd looked up to, the one I had always trusted. But another part of me felt like I had been blind for so long. I had been a fool, so eager to help, so ready to give, that I didn't see the signs. I didn't see the cracks in his perfect life, the deception that lay beneath the surface. His confession didn't change the fact that he had used me, and that hurt more than anything. The truth was that Ethan wasn't the person I had thought he was. And that realization made everything I had done for him feel meaningless. As for Claire, I wasn't sure what to make of her. She had played her part in the deception, but there was something about her response that was different from Ethan's. She had been defensive, bitter even, but there was also a sense of helplessness in her words. She admitted that she, too, had been trapped in this lie, that she had been just as guilty of perpetuating the illusion. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her. After all, she had been stuck in an unhappy marriage, a facade that had taken on a life of its own. But another part of me couldn't forgive her for the role she played in all of this. She had been complicit in taking advantage of me, and that wasn't something I could easily overlook. In the days that followed, I found myself retreating inward. I needed time alone to process everything, to figure out who I was in this new reality. I couldn't be the person I had been, the one who blindly supported my family without question. The weight of my naivety sat heavily on my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow failed myself by not seeing the truth sooner. But in the quiet moments, when I allowed myself to reflect, I realized something important: I hadn't failed. I had trusted, and in the end, that was not a weakness, it was a strength. What had happened to me was a betrayal, yes, but it was not my fault. I wasn't responsible for their lies, for their manipulation. They were the ones who had made those choices. I thought about reaching out to Ethan, trying to mend the rift. After all, he was still my brother, and a part of me wanted to fix things, to bring him back into my life. But I knew I couldn't rush this process. Trust was something that needed to be rebuilt, and I wasn't sure if that was even possible. The anger I felt toward him had settled into something deeper: disappointment. Ethan had taken the easy way out, relying on his charm and manipulation to avoid facing the consequences of his actions. He had let me be part of his lie, and that was something I couldn't just overlook. My parents tried to talk to me, too. They wanted to know if I was okay if I needed anything. They seemed so lost in their confusion, struggling to reconcile the image of their son with the truth I had exposed. I didn't have answers for them. I couldn't tell them that everything would be fine because it wouldn't be. Nothing would be fine until the pieces of this broken family were put back together, and I wasn't sure how to do that. In some ways, I felt like an outsider in my own family now. But there was a strange sense of liberation in the tea too. For the first time, I wasn't following anyone else's script. I wasn't just playing the role of the supportive sister, the one who blindly gave without question. I had learned something valuable, that I could stand on my own and that I didn't need to sacrifice my well-being for the sake of family loyalty. I had a voice, and I was no longer afraid to use it. The truth had set me free, even if it had come at a great cost. As the weeks passed, I kept my distance from Ethan and Claire. I wasn't ready to forgive them, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. The hurt was still fresh, and I needed space to heal. But in time, I came to realize that forgiveness wasn't something I had to offer immediately, it was something I could decide for myself when I was ready. Whether or not I chose to let them back into my life was up to me. And if I never did, that would have to be okay. What mattered now was that I had learned a lesson I would never forget, that I could trust myself to see through the lies and that I was strong enough to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. And while the future of my relationship with my family remained uncertain, I knew one thing for sure, I would never again let anyone take advantage of me, not even those I loved the most. The months after the confrontation passed in a blur. I distanced myself from Ethan and Claire, giving them the space they needed to sort out their issues, or at least pretend to. I focused on rebuilding my own life, reconnecting with old friends, and investing more in my career. I took long walks, spent weekends binge-watching shows I had never had time for before, and allowed myself the luxury of quiet moments. I wasn't rushing to heal because I knew healing wasn't something that could be forced. It would come when it was ready. But time, as it often does, softened the edges of my anger. It wasn't that I forgave Ethan and Claire, it wasn't that simple, but I began to understand them better. I started to see their flaws, their fears, and their desperate attempts to maintain a sense of control over their lives, even if it meant constructing a false reality. In some strange way, I found myself feeling more sorry for them than angry. Their marriage, built on lies, was crumbling, and they were both trapped in the very web they had woven. But I wasn't going to rescue them this time. I couldn't. Eventually, Ethan reached out to me. He didn't ask for forgiveness, at least, not directly. Instead, he offered an apology. It was long and drawn out, full of regret and guilt. He admitted that he had failed not only me but also himself. I could hear the sorrow in his voice, but I could also hear the fear of facing the truth he had avoided for so long. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know what to say. I had spent so much time building walls around my heart to protect myself from further betrayal that I wasn't sure how to open up again. But after a few days of reflection, I did something I hadn't done before, I forgave him. Not because I thought he deserved it but because I knew I had to let go of the resentment to move forward. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about excusing his actions, it was about freeing myself from the weight of anger that had been dragging me down. I sent him a simple message: I don't know what the future holds for us, Ethan. But I'm willing to start rebuilding, one step at a time. It wasn't a grand gesture of reconciliation, but it was a start. Claire, on the other hand, remained distant. I didn't have the same connection with her that I did with Ethan, and I wasn't sure I ever would again. I wasn't ready to invite her back into my life just yet, but I wasn't closing the door completely. Sometimes, people need time and space to figure out who they are. I had learned that the hard way, and I wasn't going to rush anyone else through their process. In the end, life wasn't neatly tied up in a bow. There was no grand family reunion, no fairy tale resolution. But the one thing I gained from all of this was a deeper understanding of myself. I wasn't the person who could turn a blind eye to lies anymore. I wasn't the person who would accept betrayal, no matter how much I loved someone. And that gave me a strength I hadn't known I had before. My relationship with Ethan would never be the same. It might never be what it once was. But I had learned that I didn't need to depend on anyone else to define my worth. I was enough on my own, and that was something I would never let anyone take away from me again. Whether or not our paths would cross in the future, I knew I was moving forward. And that was all that mattered. Wow, what a roller coaster of emotions. This story has been one of betrayal, heartbreak, and eventual healing. It's not easy to confront the people we love when they betray our trust, and it's even harder when that truth shatters everything we thought we knew. But through it all, Amara found her strength, not in the people who let her down, but in herself. If you've ever been in a similar situation where a family member or someone you trusted let you down, we'd love to hear your story. How did you cope? What steps did you take to rebuild? Leave a comment below and share your experiences with us. Your story might just help someone else who's going through something similar right now. And if you found this story insightful, don't forget to give us a like and hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. We've got more gripping tales of family drama, secrets, and shocking twists on the way. Thanks for watching, and remember, no matter how many times we're betrayed, our true strength lies in how we rise above it. Stay strong, stay true to yourself, and we'll see you next time.